Okay, I want to remind you that we have started to talk about what's called Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism is a name that is applied to a number of artists working actually in a variety of styles after Impressionism. So that's why the term Post-Impressionism is used. The Post-Impressionists were not a formal group, the way we could talk about the Impressionists or the core of Impressionists as being a formal group. They didn't show together particularly. It's simply a term that refers in general to painters who, using Impressionism in essence as a starting point, as a jumping off point, in fact, for the most part, are going to depart from the Impressionist style and begin to create a new modern style at the end of the 19th and into the early 20th century. They're going to have very different approaches, different styles. You remember that Georges Seurat was the post-impressionist who was very interested in a scientific approach to color. He invented a way to apply color so that he could seemingly measure and control how we would visually see a work of art. Paul Cézanne called color perspective. He literally geometricizes form. He wants to bring, in essence, solidity back to what he felt Impressionism had done to the world, which was to dissolve it. And of course, in a sense, he was right. So he moves in a very different stylistic direction. And now we pick up with Vincent van Gogh, and we're going to look at Paul Gauguin as well. Vincent van Gogh uses color to express his own personal feelings and emotions. Van Gogh was born in Holland in 1853, and he died in 1890. He was the son of a minister, and although he worked for a time when he was very young, probably about 17 years old, with an art dealer, first in The Hague, in Holland, and then in London for a very short period of time, he felt a calling to become a minister like his father. He worked, in fact, for a while as a missionary in a Belgian mining town before he finally turned to what would be the great love of his life, and that is painting. When he worked as a missionary, he began making sketches of everything around him. He was particularly interested in the men who worked in the mines, in the coal mines, and in their families. His initial attempts were quite amateurish because basically Van Gogh was self-taught. He had attended art school in The Hague for a short period of time. He had even studied, again, for a very short period of time at the Antwerp Academy, that's in Belgium. But the kind of orderly structure of academic training simply did not appeal to him. It was something that his temperament simply could not embrace. He was certainly not a draftsman. In other words, he was never trained to draw. So he was self-taught as someone who did do drawings throughout his life. This is a very early work by Vincent van Gogh. It's called The Potato Eaters. And it's in essence, it's the great work that he produced through his experience in living among the miners, the Belgian coal miners, because it represents what he saw around him day to day. In dark, very sooty, earthy tones with a very strong sense of contrast between light and dark, and the use of light in a very dramatic way through that one oil lamp over the table. We see an artist that, in essence, is sort of looking back to his heritage. Remember, he's Dutch. Who is the great Dutch Baroque painter who uses dark and light so brilliantly? Rembrandt. Rubens is Flemish, so it's Rembrandt. So in a sense, he's kind of looking back to that heritage, to that tradition in a work such as this. He's describing the life of the miners and their families, to whom dinner consists of boiled potatoes and tea, eaten in a dark, grimy room with very little furnishings here. The figures themselves, the faces are quite expressive, although they all look alike. They all have very much the same sort of nose. One could describe these figures as rather coarse, not even simple, but very, very coarse. Perhaps well observed, but very coarse. Not only are the faces expressive, but the hands perhaps even more so, rather gnarled looking. The work, in a sense, reveals a kind of compassion, a kind of empathy. By the way, that's a term we're going to be talking about in the context of the early 20th century, but it means feeling what others feel, and in essence, sort of suffering with them. Vincent van Gogh was a prolific letter writer. We have over 600 letters that he wrote to his brother Theo, Theo. And in one such letter, Van Gogh reflects on the life of the peasants, saying that, quote, "Man is not on this earth merely to be happy, nor even to be simply honest. He is there to realize great things for humanity, to attain nobility, and to surmount the vulgarity in which the existence of almost all individuals drags on." So he is seeing something beyond what he represents here in these peasants. Theo van Gogh, Vincent's younger brother, had become a fairly successful art dealer in Paris. And he kept trying to convince Vincent to come to Paris and study art there. And Vincent finally did. He left Antwerp, he left Belgium in 1886, and he went to Paris. Theo's gallery handled work by all the major Impressionists as well as academic painters. And in fact, the works of the Impressionists and the academic painters by the 1880s were still selling well, but probably the academic painters were selling a little bit better. In 1886, the year that Van Gogh comes to Paris, is the final Impressionist exhibition. Van Gogh studies for a brief period of time in the atelier of an academic painter. We've heard all of this before with artists who come to Paris and get into the atelier. We remember looking at this with Monet in the Impressionist video that we looked at before spring break. So he studied in the atelier. This is where he met a number of important figures in the context of French painting in the 19th century. He met Toulouse-Lautrec, for instance, on the same atelier. He would eventually begin to abandon the dark colors of his early works under this sort of powerful influence of the Impressionist palette. I mean, look at the way he represents himself in Antwerp in 1886. That's supposed to be 1887 on the right. I'm going to change it right now. It's quite phenomenal, the difference between, in essence, an old master's palette, a very conservative approach to representation, conservative dress, and then he gets to Paris, and within a year, he looks like a dandy who has fully understood Impressionism. He picked up not only the palette, but the application of paint in short, choppy brush strokes. He will even attempt a pointillist approach to painting, so he becomes aware of Seurat and the divisionists or pointillists. You can see, for instance, a view across Paris on the left-hand side, 1887, very much in that kind of dotted style of Seurat. But then he begins to broaden his strokes a bit, and we see also in 1887 something that is closer to an Impressionist landscape, but I hope you can also see that he is simplifying. Suddenly, Impressionism is starting to look as though it's got a lot of detail in it compared to the Boulevard de Clichy that we see on the right-hand side by Van Gogh. In 1887, he paints a portrait of Père Tanguy. Père Tanguy with Japanese Prince is the full title of the work, and again it dates to 1887. About 25 inches tall, so it's a good-sized portrait. Père Tanguy was a color grinder who owned an artist's supply shop in Paris. He also eventually became a picture seller. In other words, not only did he sell the supplies that artists needed, but he eventually figured out that most of the artists who needed his supplies were not making any money, and the only way to pay him was to say, here, why don't you take my latest painting, and will you give me another piece of canvas, and I need some more cerulean and other colors and a new brush. So he would exchange these supplies for the paintings. He met Van Gogh in 1887. Père Tanguy was called Père, or father, because he really was a very giving, sort of loving father figure to many of these younger artists. And in fact, many of his customers numbered among the Impressionists. We're also told that his wife used to tell him he was a fool to take these paintings on because they would never be worth anything. Can you imagine? I suppose someone has done a kind of catalog of the paintings he might have owned at one time. We know that Père Tanguy was handling the work of Cézanne at this time. So, in other words, he was taking some Cézanne paintings and supplying Cézanne with some paint. In Van Gogh's portrait, Tanguy is portrayed as a rather charming figure, an older man in his 60s, sitting wearing a blue jacket that's been pretty much fully buttoned up, hands together, very activated pant legs in terms of the application of paint, a wonderful sort of greenish colored hat. But the thing I want you to notice is what's behind him. What's behind him are Japanese prints, which have been attached to the wall. In all, both in terms of the Japanese prints and the color, for instance, of his jacket, it's clear that color is important to Van Gogh. There's strong areas of color, greens and blues and oranges and yellows, and it's very common to see contrasting colors used one against the other so that they kind of fight for dominance within the painting. Literally, now you can say, well, there is contour. If you look at the shoulders and the arms of Père Tanguy, there's contour, but there's not a lot of line in the classic tradition here. Form is modeled with color, and form is flattened in some cases through the use of line, such as we see here, which is a completely different color, a very contrasty color, and is clearly intended to be an area of color and line. One of the reasons that we see the Japanese prints behind Père Tanguy is because at this moment in time, if you remember from a work that I showed you by Mary Cassatt, many of the Impressionists had become very aware of Japanese prints and how the Japanese prints that they were looking at from the 18th and 19th centuries, the ukiyo-e prints, represented everyday life and represented the world of reality very differently, very flatly, and in terms of bright areas of design and then flat areas of color. So Van Gogh is picking this all up as well. This is an interesting photograph. I mentioned that he worked in the studio of an academic artist. This is the academic artist. His name was Cormon. You don't have to know it. But it was in this studio that he met a number of artists, including Toulouse-Lautrec, whom we actually can pick out. He's right in front here on the left-hand side, along with other students. Van Gogh is not in this picture. Van Gogh met an artist named Bernard, B-E-R-N-A-R-D, Émile Bernard, B-E-R-N-A-R-D. Bernard was a friend of the painter Paul Gauguin, and Gauguin and Bernard had painted together at different times, and both of them were very interested in color. In fact, Bernard, as he spoke to Van Gogh, quite obviously revealed that the newest idea about color is that color had inherent expressive potential, that you, in other words, don't use color realistically. Why? Why not use it in a way that it appeals to you as the artist? Now, although he began to become acquainted with, and one might say become friendly with contemporary artists, Van Gogh didn't get along with anyone very well for any length of time. He had a very erratic personality. So, among other things, and he, was never fully diagnosed correctly because he lived in the 19th century, all right, dying at a time when things were not being diagnosed very well. He was probably an alcoholic. That alone is extremely difficult. It's a terrible disease. He also suffered from fainting spells and hallucinations. He may have had epilepsy. He had alternating periods of absolute elation and energy, and then he would become depressed. Well, that's manic depression, right? And those are things that no one knew much about in the 19th century. Can you imagine having any one of those issues or problems and trying to live a normal life? One point that I'd like to make right here about Van Gogh is that he's probably an artist that most of my students have heard of, and they think of him as the crazy artist who cut off his ear. Everyone's heard that story, and we'll talk about it. It happened in the south of France. And people assume that he was a crazy artist, and the only time he painted, because his paintings are so activated and very intense, the only time he painted is when he was having a breakdown or in a depressive mode or having some kind of hallucination. That simply is not true. The only time he was able to paint is when he was under control, when he hadn't been drinking as much, when he wasn't having fits or hallucinations or suffering from depression. In February of 1888, realizing that he was on the verge of a total breakdown, one could call it, unable to control his drinking, Van Gogh departed for the south of France to live in Arles, A-R-L-E-S, that's what you're looking at here, where he lived on a small allowance from his brother Theo. He began painting almost immediately. One of the things that he loved about Arles, and actually here we're up on top of the Roman arena in Arles, looking down on two of the main streets that lead up, because this is a Roman city, and now, of course, a modern French city. He immediately was attracted by the city, by the sun, by the light. This is called the Yellow House. This is one of the first places that he lived. It no longer exists, but it's the house on the corner, which was his first house and studio. You can see it was painted in 1888, and I know that you've noticed this painting is almost entirely yellow. So in a sense, the Yellow House inspired him to then literally create a work which is based on yellow, and then it has the contrasting color of blue in the sky. Color began to greatly affect the way Van Gogh would create his works, the way he was experiencing the south of France. These are among the most intense works he would ever paint. Among the most famous works which he did during this time, in around 1888, were a series of paintings of sunflowers. This is actually one of 7 versions of the same subject, sunflowers. Again, notice the yellow that he painted. This particular version that I'm showing you here sold in 1987 for $42 million. Today, if one of these paintings came up for auction, it would at least be twice that in terms of its value. You would have to have visited the south of France in the summer to see the rows upon rows and acres upon acres of sunflowers blooming in the hot sun, to fully appreciate the significance of something he had never seen before. He came from a cold northern country, and yeah, they had tulips, but sunflowers. And they're huge. Sunflowers, as you know, because they grow in Southern California, can be taller than a 6-foot man and have huge flowers on them. So the brilliance, the personality of the sunflowers, notice that they do have different personalities in terms of that sort of eye, is something that fills his work with an extraordinary kind of spirit. Notice that he is literally making his paintings, in essence, sometimes more simple. So he simplified the surface upon which this vase sits, this ceramic-ware vase. It's literally become a flat area of color. He simplified the background yellow, a very pale color of yellow in the background. That simplicity relates to not only his own evolution, but his knowledge of techniques in Japanese prints as well. Van Gogh began to paint at a phenomenal rate beginning in 1888, sometimes working 8 to 10 hours a day, often till near collapse in the hot sun of the south of France. During a period from February 1888 to May of 1889, he painted over 200 paintings. The volume of his output became almost an embarrassment to him, because the fact is he was sending the paintings back to his brother Theo in Paris, and Theo was supposedly going to be selling all of these paintings. But I'd like to tell you at this point, in his short lifetime, Vincent van Gogh sold, will you guess, how many paintings? What do you think? Out of hundreds that he painted. Don't want to guess? How about one? One painting in his lifetime. The Red Vineyard. And it's currently in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. The volume of his output was so great that he wrote to Theo, his brother, you'll be receiving some more paintings. He says, but Quick work doesn't mean less serious work. It depends on one's self-confidence and experience. So he's really concerned that people are going to think, well, if you can put out a painting in, 3 or 4 hours in one day, how serious can that be if we try to match it or compare it to the works of the great masters of painting? So that concerned him a lot. He also wrote in another letter to Theo, "Today again, from 7 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, I work without stirring except to take some food a step or two away. I even work at midday in full sunlight with no shade at all in the cornfields and enjoy it all like a cricket." Now, if you are an artist or a writer or you have something that you love or devoted to, you probably had the experience where even if it's sitting in front of your computer playing a computer game, all of a sudden you look at the clock and an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours have gone by and you didn't even notice, right? And if you're an artist, that happens a lot because you are so involved in your work, you are so passionate about it, you're not aware of what's going on around you. He worked directly from nature, not bothering to make preliminary sketches, in case you were wondering. He drew forms on with his brush, a kind of basic idea, and then he applied the paint in very quick brush strokes. Van Gogh had studied the Barbizon painters at the art gallery where his brother worked in Paris. And he fell in love with Millet. Do you remember Millet? Jean-François Millet, M-I-L-L-E-T. Millet had died in 1875, and of course he was one of the great painters of peasants. His work was often compared just as negatively as Courbet's works to the creeping realism of 19th century art. And Van Gogh felt that since Millet had died, no one had been able to do particularly good work, and that there had been a general artistic sort of malaise. So he began painting a whole series of works based on his knowledge of Millet's paintings. And the best place to see this series is in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. So, for instance, you remember The Sower by Millet? So now this is Van Gogh's interpretation. We can see the Impressionism here, but he's definitely moved beyond Impressionism to a short, choppy application of paint and a very thick application of paint. We have another view, I think, there's Millet's Sower, and there's Van Gogh's. Very different styles. And then you can see a whole series of these based on his study of Millet, as I said, in the Van Gogh Museum. He's applying his pigment very thickly. He's building up the picture plane vertically. He's transforming Impressionism into a kind of bold patterning of color and form. This is a very famous work from Arles. It's called The Night Café. The date, again, 1888. Increasingly, he is exploring the possibility of subjective expressive color. If you like yellow, then use as much yellow as he does. If you want something to be green that is not green, that's all right. Use the green in any case, because this is self-expression. His paintings become diaries of his changing moods, of his inspiration, of his depression, of his desires, of his fears, of his belief in what and how painting should communicate. This is a cafe where he dined quite often, and he wrote to his brother about it, and this is what he said. I often think that the night is more alive and more richly colored than the day. I have tried to express in this painting the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. Remember, red and green are contrasting colors on the color wheel. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast, he writes to Theo, of the most alien reds and greens, of violet and blue in the figures of little sleeping tramps in the empty, dreary room. The color is not locally true from the trompe-l'oeil realist point of view. It is color suggesting emotions, color of an ardent temperament. You see what he's saying there? It's not realistic, but it's me. It's what I see and what I feel. And he goes on to finish up this comment about the painting to his brother. In my picture of the night cafe, I have tried to show that a cafe is a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime. Now, I don't know how often you visit cafes, but I visited a lot of cafes, and I've never had these inclinations. So, that's extremely worrisome. That's extraordinary. But that's, in a sense, what he's trying to capture. Van Gogh wanted to form a painter's brotherhood in the south of France. He wanted a number of the painters, a number of the artists whom he had met in Paris, to move to Arles. He tried to tell them enthusiastically how extraordinarily inspiring it was. And finally, his brother Theo convinced one artist to go down to Arles to join Van Gogh. And Theo did it by agreeing to pay the artist to go and then to represent him and sell his paintings. That artist was Paul Gauguin. And he's actually the next post-impressionist we're going to talk about. This is a portrait of Van Gogh painting sunflowers by Paul Gauguin. Now, by this time in 1888, Gauguin is really simplifying and flattening and using color symbolically, perhaps even more so than Van Gogh. Gauguin went for a brief stay. He arrived in the fall of 1888. Van Gogh was very excited about learning from Gauguin, having a compatriot to help him with his painting. But these were two very volatile individuals. Van Gogh probably, in essence, had a good heart, but as we know, he was ill. Gauguin was a son of a bitch. This was an extremely difficult man to get along with, a man who had such tremendously strong self-confidence about who he was and about his art. This was a volatile mix to bring these two men together. They had many arguments. In fact, they argued almost constantly, according to those who were around them from time to time. And in a well-known fit of anger and despair after an argument, Van Gogh cut off part of his left ear. And his dreams of a studio in the south of France with artists coming down and sharing were destroyed. Gauguin basically said, "You're out of your mind," and he left. So we have a series of self-portraits from this period of time in which we see Van Gogh with this bandage over what looks like his right ear, I know, but he's looking in a mirror, and it was his left ear. His face looks like it's pained, looks almost contorted here. There's a violent contrast of complementary colors, a violet blue and an orange, red and green. I mean, there's just so much going on here in terms of a clash. And notice how the red of the background wall comes right in, brings our eye right into his eyes, and there's a little bit of red in his eyes, and it moves us into looking into those eyes and seeing someone who's very ill. Van Gogh voluntarily committed himself to a mental hospital at Saint-Rémy, near Arles. Saint-Rémy, R-E-M-Y. You can visit Saint-Rémy today. Still, you can visit what was the hospital and the sort of monastic gardens where he stayed. He spent the following year of 1889 in and out of that mental hospital and other institutions because he kept having relapses of his disease. He was allowed to paint, but only when he was stable. So again, the idea of him sort of madly painting with both hands and his feet, when he's crazy is simply not true. He painted during lucid periods. During his seizures, he committed very destructive acts and suffered from hallucinations, and this may have been what happened in terms of his ear. In May of 1890, he was released from an institution and he went to Paris to visit his brother. He stayed in a village in the north where he was looked after by a doctor named Gachet, Gachet. Gachet's house was in the village of Auvers-sur-Oise. That's capital A-U-V-E-R-S. Capital A-U-V-E-R-S dash sur, S-U-R, which means on, and dash Oise, which is the name of a river, capital O-I-S-E. So Auvers on the Oise River. Dr. Gachet collected Impressionist paintings, and that was something that very much appealed to Van Gogh. He painted for about 2 months, and then he committed suicide by shooting himself in the chest. And he was unsuccessful at the suicide in the sense that it took him 2 days to die. So his brother Theo came and was at his side when he died. It is usually said that this was the last painting of Vincent van Gogh, and there seems to be very little control here. He's trying very hard to control what he sees, to control the world, but it's almost as though it's sort of exploded. He's out in the wheat fields that he loved to paint. You see the crows in the wheat field. You see different pathways that one might take, but all sort of seem to be dead ends, particularly the one in the middle. So whether or not that is symbolic, who is to say? One can imagine that with his death, he became famous, and ultimately there is some truth to that, but eventually, over a number of years, not in 1890, he was considered to be still very much someone who was out of the mainstream in terms of painting. You might imagine that his brother ultimately would make a great deal of money from his painting, but Theo died the following year and is also buried at Auvers-sur-Oise. I've actually never said SOB before in a class, but as I began to think about this man in many ways, he was sort of the ultimate narcissist, I suppose. This is Paul Gauguin, the fourth personality linked to Post-Impressionism, and together with Seurat, Cézanne, and Van Gogh, embody through their work the immediate sources of most of the ideas and attitudes about painting, about modern art in the early 20th century. Gauguin is the romantic symbol of the artist as a rebel. Turned against society in general and tradition specifically. Paul Gauguin was born in Paris, but he spent part of his childhood in his mother's home in Peru. By the time he was 7, he was back in France, where he received an education based on the classics and on great literature. So this was a well-educated man. He was married to a Danish woman by 1872, working as a successful banker or banking agent, but he was also a Sunday painter. What does that mean, a Sunday painter? A hobby, yes, it's a hobby, something you do on your day off. But that hobby became increasingly serious. He began to attend evening drawing classes at a private academy, and then he began to submit his paintings to the Salon. He exhibited a landscape in the Salon in 1876, and he exhibited with the Impressionists in 1880, 81, 82, and 86. So I'm showing you an early landscape with poplars by Gauguin, 1875. We could literally mistake this work for a Barbizon school painting or a number of Impressionist artists in their early period. So in a way, I don't know, should we say this is kind of a, I don't want to call it ordinary, but it doesn't look like Gauguin yet if you know Gauguin's work. In need of professional advice, Gauguin turned to a man who would become a mentor, a man who was a mentor to a number of artists of this period, Camille Pissarro. Do you remember we spoke of Pissarro very briefly? He was famous for his bird's eye views of the Paris streets and traffic. Capital Pissarro. Capital Pissarro. Pissarro advised Gauguin, look for the kind of nature that suits your temperament. By the way, I would not use this as a quote because this is Pissarro, an Impressionist, and we've had our test on Impressionism. So for the next test, it's going to be beginning with Post-Impressionism. So you can relax while I read this quote. Pissarro said to Gauguin, look for the kind of nature that suits your temperament. The motif should be observed more for shape and color than for drawing. Paint the essential character of things without bothering about technique. Can you see this would be a knife in the heart of an academic painter in the 19th century to say these things? This is a wonderful Gauguin from this period, Pissarro's garden at Pontoise outside of Paris. A very kind of impressionistic work. By 1883, Paul Gauguin had lost his job due to economic crises in France, and he turned to painting full-time. He could not make a living from painting. He wasn't selling his work. So eventually his wife and his 5 children returned to her home in Copenhagen, Denmark, where he visited them one time. His communication with his family was extremely infrequent, so I'm talking about letters, unless he needed something. So there was very little contact. It's as though that was a part of his life that was sort of finished. He became obsessed with what he considered to be the corruption of civilization. He had always had a longing to go to faraway places. Keep in mind, this is a man whose background is in South America, who had lived for a time in Peru as a child, who had fantasies about romantic places, places that were untouched by civilization. So again, I bring up the idea that he was a romantic who believed that the only way that humankind can survive is to have a simpler life. Modern civilization was destroying humankind. This philosophy was in part brought about by a disaffection with things like the Industrial Revolution, as you can imagine, for many people in Europe at this time. The advancing technologies of the world, the perceived and actual corruptions of the world, the degradation of people, this is something that he felt very strongly about. In part, in his search for an uncorrupted life, Gauguin worked as a digger on the Panama Canal in 1887. He traveled to the Caribbean, to the island of Martinique. And of course, he is perhaps most famous for that ultimate of voyages, 2 stays in Tahiti, in French Polynesia, in the 1890s. The first one in 1891, the second one in 1895. We're going to look at Tahiti. But prior to Tahiti, prior to these more exotic wanderings. Gauguin spent a year in Brittany, Brittany. So what's Brittany? Where is Brittany? So France is divided up into regions, yes? So as we talk about sort of counties in a state like California, Brittany is a region of France. It's in northwestern France. It's a province. And he chose to live at a small village in Brittany called Pont-Aven. Do you see the name Pont-Aven here below this photograph? Pont-Aven. Pont is bridge, Aven is the river, and it's not Avon, it's actually pronounced Aven. And it was a very well-known resort, a small village in Brittany, and it was a place where artists, Parisian artists, knew they could go, very cheaply live for months at a time, and be inspired to paint. Why Brittany? Well, as I said, it was cheaper, and perhaps no other part of France so fitted the needs now of this modern group of artists who were yearning for romantic scenery, of something that was different from the forests of Fontainebleau that had pretty much been painted by a previous generation of artists. And also the idea of a simple life and a quote-unquote primitive life. Because the people of Brittany are Celtic in origin, and they speak Breton. So they speak a different language. They all speak French today as well. In fact, fewer people speak Breton. They are also devoutly Catholic, extremely superstitious, and have retained all of their traditions, cultural traditions. They wore wooden shoes and starched headdresses. They travel by horse and cart. In fact, if I'm starting to sound like I'm describing the Pennsylvania Dutch or the Amish, yes, that was Brittany at the end of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. Now when you travel around Brittany, there have to be special occasions when you see people, and they're dressing up in costume nowadays as Bretons of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I have some photographs. So this is a photograph from the 19th century up above on the right. They're also known for lace making, as you can see. And here is one of the festivals where many of the young people are dressed up in traditional costume. And the Breton village of Pont-Aven. Gauguin wanted a more, quote-unquote, primitive atmosphere, quiet and solitude, and by George, he could live very cheaply in Brittany. Pont-Aven was a good-sized village with old slate-roofed houses located near the Aven River, whose water supply supplied power for various mills in the village, and there's one of them that you can still see today. Gauguin wrote to a friend, here's a good quote for you, "I love Brittany. I find wildness and primitiveness there." Again, I love Brittany. I find wildness and primitiveness there. When my wooden shoes ring on the granite, I hear the muffled, dull, and powerful tones which I try to achieve in painting. Gauguin was experimenting in Brittany in 1886, moving in a direction away from Impressionism. This is a still life and portrait of a fellow artist named Charles Laval by Gauguin. What I'm hoping that you're seeing in this work, in this still life and portrait of Charles Laval, is a rather unorthodox composition. You have a figure who's cut off on the right-hand side, so, the portrait or the figure is not the most important. And you have some fruit on a table, some napkins or tablecloth, a ceramicware vessel, and then a kind of inconclusive background in terms of what exactly is represented. It's just a kind of ornamental design. What you're looking at is the influence of Degas in the cutting off of the figure of Laval, and the influence of Cézanne in the painting of the still life. We know that Gauguin had purchased Cézanne paintings at Père Tanguy's as early as 1883. So he had looked at Cézanne very closely. He bought Cézanne. He returned to Pont-Aven in 1888 with a young painter friend, Émile Bernard, whom I mentioned to you earlier in relation to Van Gogh, and he began to move closer to abstraction. He wrote a friend in August of that year, "One bit of advice." This is a very important Gauguin quote. "One bit of advice. Don't copy nature too much. Art is an abstraction." Again, one bit of advice. Don't copy nature too much. Art is an abstraction. He continued, derive the abstraction from nature while dreaming in front of it. But think more of creating than of the actual result. My latest works are well underway, and I believe that you will find in them a special note, or rather an affirmation of my previous research, a synthesis of form and color derived from observation of the dominant element in nature. So he's saying when you look out at nature and you see a dominant element as a form or as a color, or as some kind of line, then that is what you need to paint. Increasingly, Gauguin was influenced by Breton life. He found inspiration in Breton tradition. He was fascinated by how religious, how pious the Breton people were. Émile Bernard is shown here in a painting which he did of Breton women in a green meadow. You can see that he is in fact painting what we saw to be characteristic costume in the photographs that I showed you, but that he has simplified everything in terms of form and color. We know that Bernard had been experimenting with a simplification of technique, a style that was inspired by stained glass windows, which they could have seen in small medieval chapels and churches in Brittany, and in woodblock images, which again, woodblock prints can tend to be very simple, very flat. And we see this in the way he has flattened the background and then flatten the figures on top of that background. If there's any sense of space in this painting, it's built up vertically, and we've talked about that before. You literally read it from the bottom, moving up to the top. At about the same time that Bernard painted this work, Gauguin painted his most famous Breton painting. It is a more complex work because of the literary meaning, because of the symbolic meaning. This is the Vision After the Sermon, also called Jacob Wrestling with the Angel. The work shows the Breton women, whom we're now familiar with. We can see these starched, elaborate caps which they wear, watching the struggle of the patriarch Jacob and an angel. This is a story from the book of Genesis. Jacob was on his way, you remember, to meet his brother Esau, and he met the angel. Gauguin has, in essence, juxtaposed a story from the Bible, which is another reality, with the reality of everyday life. So you have everyday life, and then you have a kind of mystical realm represented. We need to understand that the women, in fact, are symbolically seeing this because perhaps they've just heard a sermon about Jacob wrestling with the angel from the priest, who, by the way, is represented cut off here on the right-hand side. They've heard a sermon, and now they're kind of visualizing it as they've come outside the church, and they are, through their devotion, in essence, conjuring up the biblical event. Gauguin explained the scene as something that's being witnessed by these very devout women after that Sunday sermon. He wrote about it, quote, "To me, in this painting, the landscape and the struggle exist only in the imaginations of these praying people as a result of the sermon. That's why there's a contrast between the real people and the struggle. And in fact, they are physically and formally divided in the work by this." What is this? Oh, you're so good. You're so used to reading abstraction. This would have been considered intolerably abstract and a terrible painting in 1888. But yeah, we read this as a tree, a great tree trunk, and in fact it's dividing, the world of these women from the kind of mystical world of the Bible. Gauguin chose his colors for compositional impact and symbolic overtone, where we think we should be looking at a green lawn, yes? We're looking at a red field of battle, as though it is covered with blood. As I said, the two figures, the imaginary figures, are in the upper right-hand corner and are separated from the earthly figures on the left by that tree trunk, which, by the way, is very Japanese in feeling. The emphasis is on pure, flat areas of color, the reduction of forms to outline or to flat areas of color, with pretty much the elimination of modeling. I mean, if they were worried about Manet's rejection of value contrast, well, they should be a little more worried now with Gauguin. Gauguin offered the painting to a small Breton Catholic church. Did he do this because he was a pious Catholic and he had painted something which he felt was a very moving religious work based in a great biblical battle of grand proportions in which a man, in essence, meets God through the angel? No. He wanted to see what it would look like in the church, because for him, the church represented a kind of primitive, crude form, an ancient form. He wanted to see modern art, in essence, in this church. So it wasn't out of piety. It was because he wanted to see how shocking it might be. The priest of the church thought that it was a hoax. It was a joke. And he refused the work, saying his parishioners would not understand it. So we're going to end with that painting, and we'll take up more with Gauguin and move on Wednesday.